The first rays of sunlight stretched across the rolling hills of Yakima Valley, painting the rows of apple trees in soft shades of gold. For most farmers, mornings like this promised another day of hard work and hope. For Ethan Carter, they were a reminder of how much harder farming had become. His family had cared for this orchard for 3 generations. His grandfather planted the first apple trees decades earlier, believing that healthy land would always provide for those willing to work it. For years, that belief held true. The orchard produced beautiful harvests, customers returned every season, and the farm supported the entire family. But times had changed. Each year seemed to bring another challenge. Fertilizer prices climbed higher. Fuel became more expensive. Pests grew harder to control. And despite all the effort, the price buyers offered for apples barely covered the cost of producing them. Some evenings, Ethan sat alone on the old wooden porch, staring across the orchard while unpaid bills rested on the table beside him. He never complained, but the weight of uncertainty followed him everywhere. He knew something had to change. One chilly spring morning, several neighboring farmers slowed their pickup trucks as they passed Ethan's orchard. Instead of spraying herbicides or spreading fertilizer, Ethan was unloading fresh wood chips beneath the rows of apple trees. Beside him sat several bags marked with an unusual label. Mushroom spawn. One neighbor leaned out of his truck window and laughed. Planning to open a grocery store instead of running an orchard? The others burst into laughter. Another farmer shook his head. I've seen people try strange ideas before, but mushrooms under apple trees? That's a new one. He simply picked up another bag, knelt beside one of the trees, and carefully mixed the mushroom spawn into the fresh wood chips. To everyone watching, it looked like desperation. They believed the financial pressure had finally pushed him into making foolish decisions. By the end of the week, word had spread across the valley. Did you hear about Ethan? He's planting mushrooms in his orchard. I give him one season before he loses everything. The rumors traveled faster than the spring wind. Some people laughed openly whenever they drove past his farm. What none of them knew was that every handful of wood chips he spread carried the possibility of changing not only his future, but the way many people thought about farming. And within a year, those same voices that mocked him would be asking him a very different question. How did you do it? For weeks, Ethan ignored the whispers. Every morning before sunrise, he walked the orchard carrying bags of hardwood chips, carefully spreading them beneath each row of apple trees. Then he mixed in a mushroom spawn, covering everything with a thin layer of damp mulch. To anyone passing by, it looked like he was burying money in the ground. The laughter only grew louder. One afternoon, as Ethan stopped at the local farm supply store, 2 farmers recognized him. So, one of them said with a grin, "How are your magic mushrooms doing?" The men around the counter chuckled. Another added, "When you're ready to farm apples again, we'll help you clean up that mess." Ethan simply smiled. "I appreciate the concern," he replied calmly. "We'll see what happens." He loaded his supplies into the truck and drove away. Inside, though, the doubts were growing. The mushroom spawn had cost nearly all the money he had set aside for emergencies. If it failed, there would be little left to carry the farm through another season. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with a notebook filled with observations. Temperature, rainfall, moisture levels, shade. He wasn't guessing anymore. Every decision was based on careful research. He had spent months reading about woodland mushrooms that naturally thrived alongside trees, feeding on wood chips rather than competing with living roots. Still, reading about it and making it work were 2 different things. Days turned into weeks, then weeks into nearly 2 months. Nothing. The wood chips looked exactly as they had on the first day. No mushrooms. No extra income. No sign that his gamble would pay off. Even his daughter, Emily, quietly asked one evening, "Dad, are you sure this is going to work?" Ethan looked out the kitchen window toward the orchard. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that doing the same thing every year isn't working anymore." Emily nodded. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was an honest one. Then came the rain. A slow, steady spring rain fell for 3 days, soaking the orchard without flooding it. When the clouds finally cleared, Ethan grabbed his boots and walked the rows as he always did. At first, everything looked the same. Then he stopped. Near the base of one apple tree, something small pushed through the damp with chips. He knelt down. A tiny brown mushroom. Another. Then another. His heart raced. He walked farther down the row. Dozens of tiny mushroom caps were emerging from the mulch. Within days, there were hundreds. Not wild mushrooms. Healthy gourmet mushrooms. Exactly the variety he had hoped for. Ethan couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, the orchard had given him something completely unexpected. But convincing buyers would be another challenge. Growing them was only half the battle. Now he had to prove they were worth paying for. And the biggest surprise of all was still waiting. Ethan knew growing mushrooms was only half the journey. Selling them would determine whether his experiment had truly succeeded. The morning after his first harvest, he carefully picked every mushroom by hand, placing them into clean wooden baskets. Unlike apples that could sit in storage for weeks, these mushrooms needed to reach buyers while they were fresh. He loaded the baskets into his old pickup truck and drove to the Saturday farmers market in the nearest town. Most people walked past without stopping. They came looking for apples, honey, or homemade bread, not gourmet mushrooms from an apple orchard. Then a local restaurant owner paused at Ethan's stand. "You grew these yourself?" she asked. "I did," Ethan replied. "Right under my apple trees." She looked at him with surprise. "I've never heard of anyone doing that." She bought a small basket anyway. The following week, she returned. Not only had her customers loved the mushrooms, but they were asking when she would have more. This time, she ordered 5 baskets. A week later, another chef placed an order. Then a specialty grocery store called. Soon, Ethan wasn't wondering whether he could sell his mushrooms. He was wondering how he could grow enough to meet the demand. As the months passed, something else caught his attention. The apple trees growing above the mushroom beds looked healthier than they had in years. The thick layer of wood chips helped the soil stay cool during hot summer days and held moisture after every rainfall. The orchard floor no longer dried out as quickly, and weeds were easier to manage. When apple harvest season arrived, Ethan noticed something remarkable. His apple harvest was one of the best he'd seen in years. For the first time in a long time, the farm made a real profit. He paid off overdue bills. He repaired the leaking roof on the old barn. The aging tractor finally received the maintenance it had needed for years. Most importantly, the constant worry that had followed him every day began to fade. Word spread quickly across Yakima Valley. The same neighbors who had laughed now drove slowly past Ethan's orchard, not to mock him, but to see what he had done. One afternoon, a familiar pickup truck stopped at the edge of the orchard. It belonged to the very farmer who had joked about Ethan's magic mushrooms. He climbed out of the truck, looked around for a moment, then walked toward Ethan. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "I thought you'd lost your mind." Ethan smiled. "I know." The farmer looked down at the neat rows of mushrooms growing beneath the trees. "I've never seen anything like this." After a brief silence, he asked the question Ethan had been waiting to hear. "Would you teach me?" Ethan could have reminded him of every joke, every laugh, every sarcastic comment. Instead, he walked over to a stack of fresh wood chips, picked up a small bag of mushroom spawn, and handed it to him. "When I started," Ethan said, "I was just hoping to save my farm. If this can help save someone else's too, then it's worth sharing." The farmer nodded with quiet respect. Before long, more orchard owners came to learn. Some wanted advice. Others wanted to see the system with their own eyes. Within 2 years, several orchards in the valley had begun growing mushrooms beneath their trees, creating a second harvest from land they had once believed could produce only apples. What had started as one man's desperate experiment became a new way of thinking. Standing in the orchard one autumn evening, Ethan watched the setting sun shine through rows of apple trees while baskets of freshly harvested mushrooms waited beside crates of crisp red apples. He thought back to the day people had laughed as he spread wood chips beneath the trees. At the time, their laughter had sounded like proof he was making a mistake. Now he understood something different. The greatest ideas often seem foolish until they work. Sometimes success doesn't come from buying more land, working longer hours, or spending more money. Sometimes it comes from looking at the same piece of ground everyone else sees and discovering an opportunity hidden right beneath your feet.